Welcome to the School Sucks Project, a podcast, YouTube channel, and online community dedicated to personal growth and intellectual self-defense.
We promote learning alternatives, home education, critical thinking, peaceful parenting, organization and productivity, and better communication strategies.
Please remember to visit schoolsucksproject.com to get comprehensive show notes, relevant links,
or to just leave comments.
Follow us on Twitter at SchoolSucksShow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, username School Sucks Podcast, and get involved in our Facebook group. Just search for School Sucks Project.
Steve Patterson, welcome back to School Sucks.
Thanks, great to be here again.
It's great to have you back. I'm really excited about going through each one of these 5 principles. In the first show, you expressed this idea, new idea on my show, that if we're really trying to understand something, a new pursuit, a new discipline, even a new concept, there are several underlying principles that we need to consider and pay very close attention to and ultimately integrate, because there's a lot of overlap from one to the next. And we're going to start to see that today. We're going to go through the first principle, the principle of technique. So I was just going to give you a minute or two to review what you mean by the principle of technique, and then we'll start discussing it.
Sure. So the principle technique is kind of a overarching principle. And some of the other principles kind of are subsets of it. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially how you get from point A to point B, regardless of what A and B are. So it could be if, for example, you're trying to learn something in the martial arts, you're trying to learn a move in the martial arts, it could be literally moving your arm from point A to point B. If you're trying to learn how to play chess better and you're trying to learn how can I accomplish my goals on the chessboard, it's literally how you are moving on the chessboard. It's where you're putting your pieces. If you're trying to learn something like philosophy, there's a technique, there's a how to go about doing philosophy, understanding the concepts that you're working with, having a solid foundation in logic and metaphysics so that you can manipulate concepts in the most effective way. So that's what the principle of technique is, the how rather than the what.
That was actually how I wanted to finish up our discussion today, talking about the technique of philosophy. So maybe we can spend a few minutes on that in the end. But when you first introduced me to this idea, I was really excited because it connected me back to one of the unfortunate realizations I had while I was teaching history. And it was around, usually it showed up around the topic of like the civil rights movement in the 1960s with people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And in school, we learned that there were these isolated, very special, very heroic people who could do seemingly magical things to accomplish great goals.
Yes.
But that's not us. But we'll have a day for them. And we can appreciate them, and we can look up to them, but we can never really look into them. We can never really understand the systems of organization or the techniques or the strategies that they used when Rosa Parks sat in the front of the bus, or when Martin Luther King organized boycotts in Alabama and Mississippi. We don't learn any of that. We just learn that they're kind of magical, heroic people. So it goes beyond that narrative. People have heroes. Heroes become superhuman, godly at times, but we're always just left looking up to them and not into them. And I think that really focusing in on technique, and we talked about it a little bit in the introduction with, oh gosh, how does the best tennis player in the world's name escape me right now?
Roger Federer.
Roger Federer. So we talked about it with him and a couple others. But yeah, this is the first step towards basically being on a path to attaining that greatness for oneself.
Yes, I'm very glad you mentioned that because that was a very profound realization that I had personally. So you saw the realization in history, but this is something you can discover in tennis. It's true with Roger Federer. Roger Federer is not a demigod. We have this. As mere mortals, we have this very bad explanation of people's excellence. And we say, oh, why is Roger Federer so great? Well, he's Roger Federer. right?
Right.
As if that's an explanation.
Right.
Implying that there are these metahumans out there, whether it's Federer in tennis, or it's Ronda Rousey in the martial arts, or it's some, it's Paul Krugman, right? Why is he great? Well, he's just Paul Krugman. That's another story. But that's the same phenomenon you see over and over, is that people overlook the reality of what's going on, which is these people have superior technique for how they're accomplishing whatever they're trying to accomplish. And instead they say, oh, wow, these are special human beings. So it's very exciting for a lot of reasons, because it also implies that to get to wherever you want to be in terms of being a super high level chess player or a mixed martial artist or whatever you want to do, or understanding history and trying to change the world, you have the exact same capacity for understanding the same techniques and doing the same techniques as these people. There are very few exceptions. One exception would be something like, for example, structurally speaking, I could not be a jockey, right? I'm 6'4". I'm too big to be a jockey. In that sense, I can't be a world-class jockey. That's true, but that's one of the very few exceptions to the rule. Almost anything else, precluding something for physical structure or mental capacity or something, everything is on the table to be able to master if you want to discover the correct technique involved.
Contrary to that, and perhaps quite sadly, something that you wrote to me when we were planning these discussions, you said almost everybody does everything incorrectly. And that is really fertile ground for elaboration, because, I live 30 miles from like a nuclear power plant. I hope people there do things correctly. I hope the folks down at the water treatment facility do, I don't know, 50% of things correctly before, it comes out of my faucet. Yes. So, yeah, I get what you're saying, because there is certainly a lot of mediocrity in different disciplines and different pursuits. And I see a lot of it myself. I know that most of the things that I do to make a living, I could always do better. I don't know if mediocrity is a word that I would use to describe my current level of performance, but I know there's room for improvement. And I know in the past that, especially like using what I can do now as a reference point, if I look back and how I did things like 5 or 6 years ago, that was definitely mediocrity at best. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean exactly to you? And just looking for a little elaboration on this idea that almost everybody does everything incorrectly.
Yes. So I could talk a whole segment on this. I actually I wrote a piece about this, and it was called "Assume Everybody is Wrong." Mm-hmm. And I did a little voiceover of it too. And I kind of have a life motto, which is that everybody is wrong about everything all the time. It's not a very friendly motto, but I've discovered I think this is actually accurate. And here's what I mean. There are objectively superior and inferior ways of going from A to B. And the way that people usually think about doing their jobs, accomplishing their goals, is super counterproductive to finding the best technique for getting from A to B. So there are very few exceptions of genuine competence that is grounded in a foundation of actually understanding what you're doing. And for me, because my passion is in the world of ideas, it's especially pronounced in the world of ideas. And there's a very specific reason for it. So in the world of ideas, your foundations, the basic concepts that you're working with, your understanding of logic and consistency and not contradicting yourself. There are core techniques, I guess, to thinking about anything, which if you get those core things wrong, then you can't really know what you're talking about. And I kind of talked about this last time, like in economics, for example, if you get the basics of economics wrong and you don't understand the structure of production, and you don't understand prices, profits, and losses, and you don't understand the effects of tariffs and subsidies on international trade, then you can't understand what you're talking about. And you may get one or two conclusions right, but only by happenstance. So you have to have this grounding in the fundamentals to really have a competence of whatever you're doing. And what you find is that the majority of people out there in every discipline don't have the basics. They don't have the fundamentals right. And so, in effect, they really don't understand what they're talking about. And if I have to add one more really interesting feature to this. there's this, depending on the area or the discipline that you're studying, that you're trying to master, that you're trying to become competent in, there is a phenomena of feedback. So in the martial arts, for example, if you're doing something wrong and you're fighting with somebody, then you get punched in the face, and you learn very quickly, you get feedback about what is truth and what is not truth. I have a theory about how I'm going to move my hands. If I do it right, I'm going to protect myself, and if I do it wrong, I'm going to get punched in the face. You get immediate feedback, and there's naturally a kind of way to get a little bit closer to truth in that discipline. But in the world of ideas, that's not there. You don't have people punching each other in the face.
Right.
So it's precisely because of that lack of external feedback about the world, you get incompetence rampant in the world of ideas. In philosophy, people have no understanding of the basics. In economics, they have no understanding of the basics. In political theory, they have no understanding of the basics. And because they don't examine these foundational concepts of should we have a government in the first place, should we have a centralized monopoly issue the currency in the first place, they never examine these things. And as a result, you just have widespread incompetence. Now, so you brought up the example of like the nuclear power plant and the water treatment facility. That's an area in which, like in more engineering worlds, you have more feedback. So you
Exactly.
have
Yep.
right. So you have the laboratory settings, so you can make little tweaks and see what works and what doesn't. And same with a car mechanic, right? A car mechanic, if he does something wrong, he can get feedback on it and understand and have a direct insight into truth in a sense, because he gets immediate feedback. So that's what I mean by nobody really knows what they're doing. But there's a spectrum, right? On the extreme end, you have like architecture, like does the house that you built fall down or not? On the other end, you have something like philosophy, which is what I'm interested in, but completely lacks this feedback mechanism 100%.
Well, that's frustrating too, because as a student of history and seeing the success currently of somebody like Bernie Sanders,
Right.
I would like to think that a pretty reliable feedback loop for his ideas has already been established. It's called the history of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century.
Right.
Now I understand that tweaks have been made and things are a little different. And yes, but look at Scandinavia today. Like I understand the counter arguments, but it also seems like even when there is evidence in some cases, now philosophy is trickier, but political science is more measurable, I think, decade to decade. But we don't really see the lessons being applied. At least I don't.
Yeah, I would say I don't think that it's actually you get more feedback, because it still is cerebral. It's still intellectual. It's not something that is empirical in the same way. So you could look at the Soviet Union fall apart, and if you have no interest in learning or reading about it, you just think, oh, that just happened, and you have no explanation for it. Versus if you see something like a building falling down, that's immediate. Like there's no buts about it. It's like the building fell down, there was something wrong there, versus all these other, there's a lot of different moving parts when you're talking about political science, and there's lots of room for people to make these abstract, nonsensical explanations for things that can never actually be tested in the world.
Yeah, there's also the power of blame, right? So if you're the structural engineer of a building and it falls down, you can probably identify a clear causal chain in that process. And if you're the engineer, you can't go, Paul did it. Right. But that works in politics.
Exactly.
So, I think that there is something unique about the world of ideas that requires a proceeding with extra caution in this case. So that's very interesting.
Yes.
Building on that, I was wondering if we could get into specifics. You feel very competent in your knowledge of economics.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your process of self-education in that subject?
Sure.
I remember maybe a few months ago, I had Mises Professor William Boyes. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He speaks a lot at Mises, Austrian economist, and he's the director of the Center for Economic Liberty at Arizona State University, if you can believe such a thing exists there.
Yep.
And he was telling me in our discussion, I graduated from an economics PhD program and quickly learned I knew nothing about economics. So
Right.
you talked about doing undergraduate work in political science, but I'd like to hear how you educated yourself in economics so the people in my audience can have a better understanding of how our discussion on technique applies maybe specifically to that discipline.
Sure. So I don't think I have taken a proper economics class in college ever. I may be wrong. If I did, I forgot about it. It started, like I talked about a little bit before, my interest in economics really started when I got interested in politics through Ron Paul. And the first video I saw of Ron Paul, he was talking about monetary economics. I thought, this is really interesting stuff. And this was back in 2007. So eventually, just on the internet, I started Googling around, and I found the Mises Institute, and I found their videos and their library. Online, they have pretty much every major work that I think is out there in terms of learning about this Austrian economics, this clear rationalist economics. They pretty much have it there for free. So you just go on, you can download it and then read it, which is, when you talk to people who've been in the libertarian movement for a while, pre-internet, their minds are blown from this. They say, oh man, I used to, there was only a few libertarians that I knew, and I had to write to these organizations, and they would send a couple of books in the mail, and like there was only a really good library at NYU. And it's like now everybody has access to all that information immediately. So one of the reasons that I found Austrian economics in particular so overwhelmingly compelling was actually, ironically enough, the technique. It was the methodology of Austrian economics, which I won't go into too much detail, but there are kind of two competing schools of thought in terms of how you go about economic reasoning. You have an empiricist way of going about economic reasoning and a rationalist way of going about economic reasoning. The empiricist says, well, all of our economic propositions are up for conjecture. They're up for empirical analysis and evaluating based on the scientific method. And the rationalist says, well, no, there's actually some economic truths that you can know without having to scientifically prove them. They're not empirical hypotheses. They're logically necessarily true propositions. I thought, wow, that's really exciting and compelling. And so they start from an axiom in Austrian economics, as humans act, which is something that's necessarily true. If you try to deny it, it's an action, and it's something that's a self-evident axiom. And then they use logical deduction to deduce from there some necessarily true economic theoretical propositions. So, for example, raising the minimum wage above the market clearing price will necessarily cause unemployment. Now, that sounds like an empirical hypothesis, but when you actually work through the logic of it, it's necessary. What we mean by market clearing price and what we mean by the concepts involved, it's going to result in unemployment. Or something like in monetary theory, for example, increasing the amount of paper or increasing the amount of currency in a system and not increasing the amount of goods in a system is not going to raise people's standard of living. Prices are just going to rise, and goods will be redistributed because of that. Right? This is a logically necessary proposition given the concepts involved. So I found that to be overwhelmingly compelling, and then I just kind of went through the standard literature. You got to read Human Action, you got to read Man, Economy, and State, and other works by Mises which are good. He talks about this difference between economic theory and economic history, and that kind of set me up for being really nerdy about economics. And then I got to go to Mises University 2 years in a row, and then a third year when I was doing some interviews with professors there. Mises University is the week-long program that the Mises Institute puts on every year for students who are interested in really learning about Austrian economics. And that was very instructive. And then I was an intern at the Foundation for Economic Education once I graduated, and I was doing video production for them. And I got to go around and attend all of their seminars that they put on in the summer. And there was a crap ton. So I got to sit in on all those lectures, learning about economics. And then from there, I was on staff at the Foundation for Economic Education. I got to do it again. So I've been around these economic ideas initially due to my own interest in them and using the internet, and then professionally for many years now. And I'm still equally as passionate as I was then. I'm just more convinced that Austrian economics is the way to go about thinking about it.
So you have this benefit of immersion, but
Yes.
I'm sure there are critics. I'm sure there are, people with lots of hours logged in the university system and both undergraduate and graduate and PhD economic programs who would say, this guy got all his stuff from like one viewpoint.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
Well, it's not the case. So one of the beneficial techniques, I suppose, at Mises U, especially the first year, was a little bit less so the second year, was they would go through and explain mainstream economic positions and then explain why they're wrong. So I found that very compelling. And I have a copy of Paul Samuelson's Economics on my bookshelf right now. So and actually that's actually a potentially a good criticism, because what you do find is there are a lot of people who are self-studied intellectuals and they only have one viewpoint. And that's not a good way to learn anything. In fact, that's a very bad way to learn anything. That's a good way to be deluded, because you don't understand what you're arguing against. This happens all the time, especially in philosophy. People are rationalists or empiricists by birth, and they don't really deeply respect or understand the ideas that they're arguing against.
Well,
so,
yeah, let me tell you a little story just to make it real for people who are listening. And I touched on this in our previous discussion. I went to college and I was I won't say I ran to the left, and I don't want to sound like a victim, but I was very much pulled to the left, seduced by the left in my higher education experience. I graduated feeling a kind of, I don't know if I would go so far as to use the word guilt, but definitely an obligation, being privileged. This was before any of this was part of our vernacular, feeling like I had had a privileged upbringing and I had to give back to society, that kind of thing. And I took a job working in a boarding school for troubled kids. And all of these kids were in state custody. They were all on the Medicaid program. They were all basically, their lives, their cases were managed by state workers. So I had all of these ideals about, the progressive ideology, and that this is what needs to be applied to society, because those were the lessons that I learned in college. And now I found myself on the front lines of applying them. And I saw the amount of corruption that when people are in state custody, when children are put on Medicaid, they're given drugs. That's like a 1, 2, 3. That identify a problem, go on Medicaid, be put on often dangerous or at least like drugs that have very bad long-term health consequences and short-term health consequences. And I felt, once I started to realize the level of corruption, or at least the lack of consideration for these people that we were supposed to be helping, I felt like my entire world was shattered, So I found myself basically in a kind of ideological, philosophical vacuum.
Right.
And I didn't know what to believe anymore. And this was around, 2002. I was going to graduate school, and I got very, very conspiratorial. I ran now I'm running. I'm not being seduced. I'm running to Alex Jones, to InfoWars, to Coast Radio. That was like 12 years ago. And slowly from there, it was the process of discovering the philosophy of liberty that was like this beautiful wake up that helped me create this mind map, I felt, of how the world works. And it doesn't require paranoia. It doesn't require living this shattered existence of broken dreams and ideals. So that was my process. I felt like I did have something to contrast it to, but I also, like, when, I tell people some of the things I listen to and they say, why do you listen to that? And I say, because I don't agree with it. That's all that I really want to take in right now. I feel like I have, and you're probably the same way, right? You feel like you have a solid enough foundation. You want to go out and see what cases are being made counter to your views and maybe take them apart.
Absolutely. And specifically, I am partial to that method in philosophy, just because what you find is you have to go down to very deep premises in order to judge whether or not a worldview is something that's plausible. I'll give you a few examples. So like I mentioned before, I grew up in a conservative Christian household. Mm-hmm. And now I'm a rationalist philosopher, and I reject many of those ideas that I used to hold. However, what you find is in the community I'm in now, people are immediately just vitriolically dismissive of religion and religious ideas. I think it's largely because they don't understand them. They've only been in this rationalist community, or maybe they've had a really bad upbringing in, with Sunday school religion.
Right.
And so they just poo-poo and say, oh, religion's a bunch of crap. Or that's all it is. That's just a bunch of crap, dismiss it, and then they're off talking about how scientific they are. That's not a sound methodology. And the reason is religion and any other area of thought, any other area of examining a certain particular set of ideas, there are presuppositions which, if they're true, they can lead towards seemingly radical conclusions, and if they're false, they can lead towards seemingly radical conclusions. So take, for example, the concept of eternal life. There's a lot of people out there who would immediately say, oh, eternal life is ridiculous, and you're dumb and superstitious if you believe in it. Like, well, no. You don't understand. Eternal life is not an inherently self-contradictory concept, and it depends on what your conception of the self is. If it's the case, for example, that your consciousness is something that is fundamentally not reducible to physical matter, when there's a lot of people that believe that for purely philosophic or scientific reasons, they would be called dualists, then it's perfectly reasonable to say, oh, well, when the body goes away, the consciousness doesn't go away because these are two separate things. Then it's not unreasonable. So what you have to do is, rather than dismiss the concept of eternal life, you have to understand and go to this concept of, well, what is the self? What is consciousness? If consciousness is non-physical, then yeah, eternal life is an open question. If consciousness is physical, and when you die, all of the bits of matter go away, then yes, eternal life is absurd. But not by itself. You have to go to these deeper principles, and then you examine, well, why are people dualists? What are the evidence for this kind of category distinction between the physical and the mental? And then you get down into philosophy. It's like, oh, well, actually, these conclusions aren't self-evidently ridiculous. They're just based on a particular chain of reasoning that you have to trace down to its roots.
Yeah, and I think it's one that starts with clearly defining your terms, right?
Certainly.
This gets skipped a lot in philosophy and political philosophy. So if you explain that belief in just a couple sentences about, well, yeah, when you die, your consciousness goes somewhere else, and someone says, wow, that's stupid. There's a lot to unpack in that statement and its response.
Exactly.
Right?
What is consciousness?
What is consciousness? Exactly. So this is kind of returns us to technique, right?
Yes.
There is a technique in philosophy that I did, like I said before, I wanted you to elaborate on as well. But can we do one more for economics?
Sure.
Just applying technique. So right now, one of the moves that is certainly gaining a lot of traction in the public discussion is the $15 minimum wage. So how do you approach something like this? Like, let's say you encounter someone who really believes this, and you want to, the best you can, walk them away from this belief that the $15 minimum wage is just, that it solves a multitude of economic problems. How do you approach that?
So it depends entirely on who your audience is.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of different ways of approaching any given topic, but especially the minimum wage, and it depends on how deep you want to go. If your goal is to educate somebody and have them actually understand economic principles, then it's not an easy task, and you have to start with, what is employment? Well, what is this phenomena where we see somebody pay somebody else to do some work? What's going on there? And then you examine, okay, the person who is employing has a certain set of incentives. They want to get certain things done so that they can make a profit doing it, so that they're not making a loss and they don't have to stop doing it. They want to make a profit. And they think to themselves, well, gosh, I can't do all this work myself. I need somebody else to take on some of this workload. And so they look for somebody whose incentives are aligned, somebody who's thinking, gosh, I need to make money. Who can I team up with to get paid? What work can I accomplish to get paid? Because I want to get paid so I can eat and these other things. And then you have this incredible mutually beneficial engagement between the two people where they say, hey, look, I need an employee, and hey, I need an employer. Let's negotiate what the cost of employment is. Mm-hmm. Right? So we can go that route and we can say, okay, well, it needs to be, it has to do with the value that the employee is creating. If it's sweeping the floor, then the employer is not getting enough value created to justify employing the employee at $50 an hour, let's say, or maybe even $15 an hour. If it's brain surgery, right, and the employer is a hospital and the employee is a brain surgeon, well, you can justify paying them $50 an hour. So it just depends on the value that's being brought to the table for both parties. So you can go that way, you can explain it, or honestly, sometimes this doesn't sound kind, but sometimes there is no genuinely effective way to present the explanation for why the minimum wage causes unemployment in a brief manner. And if there is, it's not my specialty. Milton Friedman was good at doing it, and he got people thinking about these things in ways they found persuasive. But what I find is, like, I'll put it this way. The minimum wage, confusion about the minimum wage resolves itself when you understand the principles of economics. So if you focus on the basic principles of economics, then you'll just understand why having an artificially high employment rate or a minimum wage rate is going to cause unemployment. So yeah, that's what I say. And in fact, one of the videos I produced for Fee was, it's called The Truth About the Minimum Wage. And it's my own attempt at like a 3-minute or so explanation for like value creation. And, if people aren't creating enough value because they don't have the particular skill set to create that much value, then a minimum wage necessarily means they're going to be losing their job, and it's counterproductive. But that was my own attempt at it.
Absolutely. And I think this is going to come up more, or an elaboration of this, when we actually talk about fundamentals or
right.
understanding the basics. So yes. I wanted to return because I think that I raised that question because you said it might sound unkind that sometimes there might not be a way to do that. Yeah. I would say that's most of the time. I would go as far to say that's almost all of the time.
Fair enough.
And if you encounter a group of people who are marching for that cause, they probably have very little interest in your ideas. And I think that takes us to a bigger problem, which is who controls the box in which, ideas are fed, basically. And I think a lot of this is the media, a lot of this is academia. And one of the things that people have a tremendous amount of really unearned trust in is credentials, right? So can we talk a little bit about the problems with credentialing?
Sure. Yeah, this is a very big topic, and it would be difficult to separate the problems of credentialing with the problems of the credentialers.
Yeah, exactly.
So credentialing in the abstract there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's just, look, I have this badge that says I'm competent based on this organization that judges competence. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a signaling mechanism to future potential employers or people that you want to buy your book or whatever that what you're talking about. But what has happened is a gross perversion of the credentialing system entirely as a function of academia as it operates right now. Not academia in the abstract, but the actual system and establishment of academia. And it correlates beautifully with what we're talking about, competence in general, because I'll give you my conclusion kind of up front. Based on my own understanding of economics and philosophy and all these other things, and the majority of the mainstream being wrong, it demonstrates a gigantic error in the credentialing system. It damns the credentialing system. In effect, it's the exact opposite of what it's supposed to do. So if you say, oh, look, I have my economics degree from Harvard, now that doesn't mean you understand what you're talking about. If you actually believe what you were taught, it's actually that's a marker that you don't know what you're talking about, but you think you do. So we're in this topsy-turvy world because nobody ever challenges the essential framing arguments in the academic world. The whole idea of expert consensus has resulted in this completely upside down world where experts think they know what they're talking about, but they actually don't. But it's entirely a function of credentialing. So I did a video on this not that long ago, and it's like the phenomena is you have these people that look down and they see badges on their chest and they think, oh, wow, I must really know what I'm talking about. I'm this credentialed person. And they look at all their peers in academia and they all have badges on their chest. They go, wow, those people are all credentialed. They must know what they're talking about. And then they think, hey, go figure, all of those people agree with the same conclusions that I have. Therefore, those must be the true conclusions.
Exactly.
And the people that are outside the system, like you and me, when we criticize them, they say, oh, well, you don't have the badges. So therefore, all of these experts agree you're a crank.
Yeah.
Right? So there's no way, unless you go within the system to try to correct some of these foundational errors that academicians make.
You know, it's probably true, though, that same kind of insularity can also happen outside the system.
Certainly.
You know, like in circles of Austrians. I know here in New Hampshire, there has been a real break in, the libertarianism here is not one thing anymore. As it once felt like it was, like more people were on the same side about. I mean, there were always differences in tactics, like are the solutions coming through civil disobedience or politics or agorism, but now it seems like there's a fracture between the more right wing and left wing. Like it's really like that political division is happening, and it's really, really interesting because it wasn't something that I saw so clearly the first several years that I was here in New Hampshire and involved with like the Free State community. So it's an interesting development, but there's probably a lot of subcultural and countercultural movements that completely stop making progress because of that same social phenomenon.
Yes, the example I like to use, and I'm finding it more and more accurate the more I research mathematics in particular. The example I'd like to use is religion again, because the phenomena you see in religious circles is that you have the kind of the pastors in any given denomination of any religion who all agree with one another. They agree on the foundational premises of their religion, and they get together and they share accolades with one another. Oh, you're a great pastor. Oh, you're great at this. Oh, this is the great book you published. And there's no, like we were talking about earlier, there's no feedback mechanism. It's this echo chamber phenomena. It doesn't necessarily mean all their conclusions are wrong. It just means that methodologically speaking, there's not that dissenting voice which people think, oh, hang on, maybe, just maybe these foundational premises are wrong. So it really is the exact same groupthink phenomena is what you see in strong religious circles. It's what you see in strong political circles, and it's exactly what you see in academia. There's no difference between them.
And a lot of people seem to think that the sciences are immune to that problem.
Right.
Don't they? Yeah.
And that's so. If anybody's interested, I wrote a very long article on quantum physics. It's called Quantum Physics and the Abuse of Reason. So in the world of ideas, there are certain topics which people will inevitably bring up whenever they're trying to justify a ridiculous conclusion. One of them is the liar's paradox in philosophy, and the other main one is quantum physics. They start talking about how, when you close your eyes, reality isn't any particular way, and then when you open them, like your consciousness creates reality, and it's a whole can of worms. And so this happens so much that I looked into it. I thought, what is going on here? Why does everybody keep bringing up quantum physics? What you discover is many things. One, there is the people that are abusing quantum physics, like the Deepak Chopras of the world, who are just kind of mystical woo-woo people that there's not a lot of rational grounding in what they're talking about. It just feels nice. They're just abusing terminology. But there's this other shocking, perhaps even more shocking, phenomena at play here, especially because this is an area of the natural sciences. There is, I'm not going to go too much into the weeds here, but the mainstream interpretation of quantum physics for the last century, though this is now starting to change in maybe the last decade or so, has been what's called the Copenhagen Interpretation of quantum physics. The Copenhagen Interpretation is nonsense. I'm telling you, anybody can look into it. You can read the article. I demonstrate it is nonsense. There was a big fight in the first part of the 20th century from people like Einstein and Schrodinger and these other really intellectual physicists trying to combat this irrationalist Copenhagen interpretation. And for whatever reason, the rationalists lost. And so we've had this phenomena of, for 80 years, the mainstream consensus on quantum physics in the natural sciences, in physics, of all of the areas of thought, which is supposed to be the highest, the king of all the sciences in physics. In all the areas of thought, you have outrageous nonsense. It's not an exaggeration. People should check it out if they have a minute. And I'll just say one thing. I actually, something I wanted to mention later on, but I'll say it now because it's perfectly relevant. This Copenhagen interpretation is so bad. I guess I'll just give you a little bit more.
Yeah, what is it in a nutshell?
Yeah. I'll just give you a little concreteness, because it essentially is the idea that reality is indeterminate. That, in other words, everything happens by chance, is the nutshell argument. And they have particular reasons why they say that. Essentially, they created, there's this phenomena that physicists have seen for a long time and have not had a good explanation for. It's in the double slit experiment. They have this weird phenomena where particles appear, or light photons appear to behave like waves and particles kind of at the same time, but kind of neither, and sort of depending on if you're squinting one eye or not. Like, it's this really weird phenomenon that's taken place. And what they've done is they developed a mathematical description of the phenomena. They say, 50% of the time this happens, 50% of the time that happens. And that's the only way they can accurately predict, in the aggregate, this weird phenomenon that's taking place. They've not found a way to say concretely, with these inputs, these are the outputs that you'll get. Okay? So they developed this mathematical function to now aggregate and say, well, we can't know every particular time we run the experiment what the output will be, but we know in the aggregate what it'll be, 50% of the time here, 50% of the time there. They've taken this and they've concluded the reason that's the case is because reality is stuck in a state of mutually exclusive paradox, and it only resolves itself at the end of the experiment. So for example, it's like I'm flipping a coin, right? And I don't know if it's going to be heads or tails 50% of the time. It could be heads, could be tails. And my conclusion is, the reason that's happening is because reality is actually in a state of heads and tails. And when I open my eyes, boom, it resolves itself into either heads or tails, right? I'm not kidding.
No,
that is essentially the argument that they make in many more words. And that has been believed for 80 years. Fortunately, it is now taken, it's certainly not the mainstream. There might be a plurality of people who still believe it, but there's alternative explanations where people are saying, by George, just maybe this Copenhagen interpretation of everything being indeterminate and chance is not actually the case. And so, yeah, I went into this anyway. I wrote this, I think it's like 4,500 words long. So far, it's the most popular thing that I've ever written. It's been seen probably over 100,000 times now by people on the internet who are like, hey, some of them say, hey, you have no credentials. You can't be talking about physics like this. And other people say, hey, that's actually a pretty good argument. I'm sorry. Okay, last thing on this topic. What I wanted to say was, for many years, I don't know if this is the case now, but for many years when students were learning physics, they were dealing the mathematical calculations in quantum physics. Apparently, there was even a phrase that would be used from the professors when they were talking to their students about the calculations. If the students were to ask, I kid you not, the students were to ask, hang on, what does this calculation mean in terms of reality? Like, what are these numbers referencing here? What's actually going on? The phrase was, shut up and calculate. That's literally, you Google shut up and calculate.
This is mind-boggling to me. This is mind-boggling.
It's flabbergasting. It is flabbergasting. And I actually, don't have to go into it. If you think that's crazy, I could tell you some things about mainstream conclusions in mathematics that would blow your mind about adding. Okay, I got to tell you, since we're on it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
If you want to have your mind exploded and lose all faith in academia, all you have to do is go to YouTube or go to Google and punch in 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 + 5 ... and see what you get. And I'll tell you what you get. There is this idea in mathematics, which is what I've said. I've hinted in the last time in some of my videos. Mathematics I find to be this area where, totally to my surprise, you have this core idea of irrationalism in mathematics, which just blows my mind. But you have this idea: take an infinite series of positive integers, 1 + 2 + 3 + 4, ad infinitum, and what do you think the result would be? What do you think the sum of an infinite series of positive numbers is?
The sum of an infinite series of positive numbers.
Right.
Well,
you would think infinity? Would you at least think that seems reasonable?
I don't even know if that's, well, that's what I was thinking about, because if the series is infinite, well, yeah, okay, so I guess that's as far as we can go, right?
Yes, okay. So
then fine,
if your intuition is, well, can you add up an infinite series? That's a good intuition, because no, you can't. And I wrote about that, but we won't go into it. Let's just say it would seem reasonable to say, well, the answer's got to be infinite if it's an infinite series of positive numbers. No. The answer is, drum roll please, -1/12.
The fraction 1/12.
A negative fraction, Brett. I'm not kidding. There is a video online, an excellent video with like millions of views. It's from Numberphile, where they go through and they prove that 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 ad infinitum is -1/12. I've talked to mathematicians about this and say, oh yeah, it's the Riemann zeta function. So it's this, that, it's this, that. It's like, you have got to be kidding me. How could this have happened? And that is the case. Now, last thing I'll say about that, because I know we still haven't gotten that much into technique here. There is a way to preserve some measure of sensibility in the answer -1/12. There is a way. But I would say, from my conversations, the literal majority of mathematicians will accept the idea that we're talking about actual addition, that our intuitions of literally adding these numbers together will result in a negative fraction. There is a way to preserve the sensibility, but most people don't seem to make that argument. And it's a scandal. It's scandalous.
It's beyond my comprehension, especially where the fraction comes from. The negative fraction.
The negative fraction, right? And then the conclusion is, oh wow, how profound. Like the answer to like the Copenhagen Interpretation, like this -1/12 nonsense. People go, oh wow, that's a mind bender. How deep? Like, no,
right.
That's not what's going on. It's nonsense. Yeah. That's as much as I'll say about that. But suffice to say, people will have their minds blown by examining that particular idea. And you read through the comments of like these articles and say, oh yeah, I understand. Oh yeah, no, this is totally legitimate. It's like, you guys are insane.
So we see the level of frustration that can be caused by what I think in a lot of these disciplines are methodological problems, right?
Yeah.
Let's return to cause and effect reality, where we're very comfortable, and talk about technique in areas like the martial arts in a little more detail than we did in our introductory show.
Yes. Excellent. So I'll start with a little story, because I think this really illustrates the importance of technique rather nicely. The dojo in which I've been training for the last couple of years, the head instructor I have a massive amount of respect for, and there was another instructor there named, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on his name, Omar. He's from Peru. Super nice guy, super competent, excellent technique. He's great. However, in class one day, at the end of class, he said, so let me ask you, what is more important? Is it the theory of jiu-jitsu or is the practice of jiu-jitsu? And naturally, everybody said, well, he's from Peru. Naturally, that's why he had the accent. And naturally, everybody said, oh, well, the practice is more important than the theory. And I kind of said, well, I think it's theory. And he said, what? No, it's not theory, it's practice. And then he went to explain why practice is more important than theory. And the correlation is between technique and theory. And the argument that is intuitive and what you hear most of the time is that doing is more important than these kind of abstract theoretical things. You got to do, you got to practice, you got to be in there and just do it, and then you'll get good at something.
Practice makes perfect.
Exactly. So
yep.
that is not by itself true. In fact, that's demonstrably wrong. What theory is, what technique is what you are practicing. It's not that you are practicing, it is what you are practicing. And if you are practicing something wrong, if your technique is wrong, if your theory is wrong, your practice will not get you any closer to competence. It'll do the opposite. You'll be practicing something, you could be in a bad habit as a function of your practice. So theory or technique is kind of this one step above in terms of importance, the actual practice. So in jiu-jitsu, specifically of all places, in the world of the martial arts, if your goal is to learn how to defend yourself in the street, and your technique is Aikido, or your technique is Tai Chi, I'm sorry to say, but your technique is objectively inferior to something like Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And to the extent that somebody has just done the practice in Aikido, and they're an Aikido master, and they've been doing it for 20 years, I'm telling you, they're going to get their butt kicked by somebody who's been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 6 months or a year. That's not an exaggeration. There are a lot of videos online of specifically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or grapplers fighting people from these other styles, and it's just an embarrassment. And it's not because they're dumb, they're stupid. It's not because there's any physical craziness that's going on. It's entirely because they got their technique wrong. So the reason that's monstrously important is because like I said, if your goal is mastery or understanding or learning anything, you have to take the time to seek out the correct technique. It's not just going down to the closest dojo and signing up. Like, oh, that looks cool. Yeah, I'm just going to do that. And then you could devote years of your life to that, and you're good at that, but that's a bad thing to be good at because they get the techniques wrong, right? You have to specifically try to think, okay, who or what is the best way that I can learn objectively superior technique? So you go online and you start YouTubing. So if you're trying to learn, for example, like in golf is a great example because the technique is just outrageously important. If you're trying to learn how to drive the ball in golf and you're trying to teach yourself absent coaching, absent YouTube, you're just thinking, okay, well, I'm just going to whack this thing and see how far it goes. It doesn't matter if you're out there for 10 years. Most likely, you're going to be wasting your time. Versus if you go online and you see the YouTube videos, you find the YouTube videos of people who can hit the ball 300 yards effortlessly, and they're explaining to you the technique, that's where you spend your time. Now, it's practice makes perfect, assuming that you've got your theory in order, you've got your technique in order. A great example of this, there's a girl named Lydia Ko, who's a professional golfer. She's an LPGA golfer. She's all of 5'5" and maybe 120 pounds. And she averages her drives like 250 yards. Now, wow. The average male golfer in the United States is, I think it's like 170 or 180 yards or something like that. So this lady who's tiny can manage to hit the ball 250 yards on average. Now, we could have the mystical explanation, say, oh, well, she's just Lydia Ko. Well, that's not the case because there's lots of female golfers who can hit the ball even farther than she can. So what's going on? It's not that she's just not brute strength. She's not divinity. It's entirely her technique. Entirely a function of her technique. If Lydia Ko can hit the ball 250 yards, I guarantee, unless you have some kind of literal physical structural abnormality, you can hit the ball 250 yards. I can't because I haven't put the time in golf, but I know I could because all you have to do is seek out the right people with the right technique.
So for me, it was the guitar. And someone asked me, they say, you play the guitar? I said, because I had a guitar like sitting in the studio, or somebody said, oh, you play the guitar? I said, I actually have negative skills at the guitar. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The metaphor that I use is, if there is a tunnel that I needed to go through called skill and competence, I dug a hole next to it while kind of accidentally backfilling the tunnel that I needed to walk through. I started messing around with the guitar, saying that I was going to be self-taught, using the internet in a time before YouTube existed, but it was also a time where you could get the tabs to any song that had already been made.
So you try to teach yourself with tabs.
Yep. And all you can see is where your fingers go. You don't even know what fingers they're supposed to be. Right. And this was from the basic formation of chords to actually playing songs. So by the time that I had figured out how to play a handful of songs using tabs, or even just from, chords, I was off and running with a series of bad habits that I would basically have to go back to square one to be able to correct. So, and I spent a lot of time doing that too.
I mean, that is like the perfect example. Everybody's done. I think everybody's done that. Like that's just part of the process of growing up, is discovering that the way you've been doing something is not only bad, it's counterproductive. And there's so many good examples of that, Brad, it's not even funny. Like, the world of ideas is the thing that I think intuitively, specifically in economics, how many people, because they don't have the grounding in solid fundamentals, have an economic education, but actually are farther away from arriving at the truth than if they knew absolutely nothing. At least somebody who is open to learning, I don't know what's going on. I just have basic intuitions about things, is going to be more willing to learn than somebody who thinks, who has established the habit, if you will, of playing the guitar incorrectly, who has established the habit of playing economics incorrectly. You see that all the time. You see it in the martial arts all the time. People will come in and they, oh yeah, I've been training this style for a long time, and they're all herky-jerky and awkward because they've never, so for example, like in Taekwondo, this is an area of the martial arts where people focus on kicking. It's like really beautiful, cool techniques of kicking that, wow, they're really nice to watch. Or another one is wushu, is what it's called. These gorgeous, gorgeous kicks. Okay, well, that sounds great. And they think they've trained their body to be able to do these incredible things in Taekwondo. And then what happens is they get into a ring with somebody that has not just ground fighting, but uses their hands as well, or like a boxer can clinch, that doesn't give them the distance that they didn't even realize they needed. And it's like, you are farther away from being able to defend yourself than you would be if you were completely ignorant of the entire topic. Like, if you don't know anything about the martial arts, you're probably going to try to bite. Good. Like, if that is your instinct and that's your intuition, that's going to be closer to be able to defend yourself than if you're trying to do these 720 spinning kicks that haven't a chance in hell of actually working in the street. It's an excellent example with guitar.
Yeah, absolutely. It works with economics as well. And there's a nice illustration you can do with people that I tried a couple of times. It's called Bring in a 10-year-old. And I remember having the worst time with somebody arguing about how all of the money that is made available for higher education drives up the cost of higher education. And this person that I was arguing with just refused to believe that this was reality. And I asked a 10-year-old, if you sold ice cream and you found out that everybody in the vicinity of your ice cream truck was getting money specifically towards the purchase of ice cream, they could only use it to buy your ice cream, what would you do with the price of your ice cream? And he's like, oh yeah, it'd make it more expensive. If they have the money being given to them, they'd pay more, And so somebody who felt like because of, watching CNBC or reading the New York Times, they had this further along understanding of this topic, was actually in a place behind a 10-year-old, behind somebody who had maybe 4 years of formal training in mathematics in public school, that made this young person superior to this person who thought they knew so much about how the world worked.
Yes, I want to piggyback on that with two things. One, this is true in philosophy in the most profound of ways. So the foundation for all critical thinking, for all philosophy, for all economics, for literally the bedrock foundation for all critical thinking is logical consistency. This is what I'm writing my first philosophy book on. I'm working on it right now. It should be out like in the next couple of months. It is not contradicting yourself. There are two main logical principles, the principle of identity and non-contradiction, that are literally essential, like necessary, foundational, could not be overstated in terms of their importance for building a coherent worldview or even a coherent thought. Principle of identity is that A is A, or things are whatever they are. And the principle of non-contradiction is to say it would be false to claim that something is the way it isn't, that A and not A is false. Those two principles are foundational. And only in the ranks of high intelligentsia in academia do you get books explaining why those two principles are wrong. So what the principle of trot out, which is absurd, a self-evident absurdity, the principle of trotting out the 10-year-old is so applicable to philosophy, because you have these people who are like, no, you don't understand. The cat is a cat, and it is not the case that it's a cat because blah, 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 blah. Quantum physics is one of the things they'll bring up. Mm-hmm. And the 10-year-old will say, well, you're full of shit. Well, except probably wouldn't say shit, but like you don't, what are you talking about? Like if something is, that's how it is. Like it wouldn't be some way if it were some other way. And they say, well, no. I mean, that's a very elementary, that's a very simplistic way. That really is the term that the derogatory term that they use. They say, oh, it's simplistic. Oh, you just have a simplistic understanding of philosophy. Same thing in economics. You say, no, like understanding why the minimum wage causes unemployment is elementary. And they say, no, it's not elementary. It's simplistic. You have to go through the 8 years of higher education to understand why everything is a great blurry paradox and nothing makes sense. And all of the foundations that you learned are somehow not true anymore once you get to that level of elite thought. When, of course, in reality, the truth is the opposite. That you go through the higher educational system. If you arrive at these self-evidently absurd conclusions, it's entirely a function of you being deluded. And unfortunately, people who are deluded will end up with these credentials where then you have this society that's like, oh, well, Graham Priest, for example, is a philosopher that writes books about how he has a term, it's called fuzzy logic. Things aren't logical. They're not A or not A. They're A, not A, somewhere in the middle. It kind of depends. It's wishy-washy. It's like, how can you take these people seriously? They shouldn't be.
I agree.
So there's one unique phenomena, though, that I do want to bring up just to kind of throw a wrench into everything here. It seems reasonable to say that there is this strong correlation between competence and the demonstration of competence. If you know what you're talking about, you should be able to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. So, like if you're an architect, you got to be able to build houses. If you're an engineer, you got to be able to build stuff. And it also seems like if you're incompetent, you shouldn't be able to do those things, right? That seems intuitive, but actually, that's not always the case. There's this a devilish principle, an interesting phenomena that happens in some disciplines. An excellent example of this is in poker. So I'm a chess player, and I tried to get into poker, and my evaluation, you have to have more steely resolve to play professional poker, high-level poker, than you do chess.
It's emotional. Yeah, it's an emotional game.
And the reason it's emotional, for me at least, is because you can play perfect poker and lose. It's not the case in chess. You play perfect chess, you're going to draw at worst. Mm-hmm. But if you play perfect poker, you can lose to somebody who has not a clue what they're doing. The reason is because luck is a factor in terms of the different dynamics that are in poker. But you can literally have somebody who says, I know what I'm talking about. I'm an expert in this. I know all the principles. It's crystal clear. And they can go up against somebody who is like, got a sombrero on their head and a Hawaiian shirt and 2 drinks, and they're drunk and they're like, yeah, whatever. I don't care about poker. Oh, yeah, how do you play? And they can play and they can sit down, and that person who has mastered poker can lose literally all of his money at that session to somebody who is completely incompetent. That is something that's really hard to handle. And the reason that's the case is because, like I said, it's luck, but also the game of poker and all these other things, you're playing the long run. So the poker, the demonstration of competence is not in the short run, it's in the long run. The same is true in economics. Somebody who predicts a financial crisis that doesn't happen that year or the next year, but it's in the long run, it happens 6-10 years from now, they can still understand what they're talking about and still appear to not know what they're talking about in the short run. This is kind of I won't go into it, but there's kind of a profound philosophic principle here of the theory versus the data that's also at play when somebody can know what they're talking about, though from the outside it appears as if they don't, though they can still know that they do in that moment.
Right.
That makes sense.
Indeed. There was one more thing that I wanted to bring up, and it kind of it relates to this just slightly, but it relates to our last two examples about, struggling to try and understand basic principles in economics, or fighting your way through thinking you're learning to play the guitar. And people who have mastered technique, you mentioned the appearance of a kind of effortlessness.
Yes.
That I wanted to talk a little bit. Where do you say this is most relevant or most visible, I guess?
It depends on what you mean by visible. If you mean physically visible, then it's in any physical discipline. I wouldn't say there's one or the other. Guitar is an excellent example.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so if you take a masterful guitar player, and this is something maybe we'll talk about in a lot more detail on the principle of efficiency, but if you watch them play, right, they play these a bajillion notes every second. They're just doing this little thing with their hand. It's like, well, how are you doing that? It looks like you're just make this very basic motion. And the reason that's the case is because they've discovered the correct technique of literally how to move their fingers in an efficient and effective way. And then they've practiced to the point where it almost is effortless. It's not something that they have to mechanically think about, oh, I got to move my fingers in this particular way. Roger Federer is another magnificent example of this. It looks like he's just kind of this fluid thing on the court because all of his shots are just gorgeous and they appear effortless. There's a very relaxed body. The shots are beautiful and precise. And so another visible way that you could see is effortlessness. It would be in the world of ideas or in the world of mental efficiency. So this is something we'll definitely talk about more. The very principle of Occam's razor has to do with effortlessness and efficiency. It's eliminating all of the unneeded ontological categories that you require to explain whatever phenomena you're experiencing. So for example, right, if you see it's raining outside and you have this very complex explanation, oh, well, the gods are very upset, and then there's the stars are aligned in this way, and like the groundhog came up just at the right time, and now we have the phenomena. That's one potential explanation. The other is, oh, well, you understand, you don't have any of this superstition or mysticism, or there's no gods. All it is entirely a mechanical function of, the state of the climate that just naturally results in. It's like, oh, it's a much simpler explanation.
So the Ptolemaic system of astronomy would be a good example of this.
I've written about that because it's an excellent example of a lot of things, but that would be a beautiful example of where there is a simpler thing that's going on rather than think that the objects in the heavens are doing this beautiful circle and then they do this little squiggly and they go backwards and then they continue this beautiful circle. Maybe that's the case, or maybe it's that the sun is in the middle of the solar system and you have the elliptical curve, which is more simple than having these perfect circles and then the squiggles in the back. And even though you still have the same predictive power, one technique or one efficient way of explaining that phenomena is superior to the alternatives.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples that I talked about in the early days of my show was the increasingly convoluted rationalizations for state power as they were subjected to reason for longer and longer periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it started out where it's like, well, I'm a god, and that worked for a while, and then it was like, all right, well, I'm not God, And we're not gods because, yes, we've noticed we die, and but we talk to God. All right, we don't talk to God, but we know what he wants. Our friends talk to God. So we are here to do his will. Okay, fine. Yeah, we don't do God's will, but what we do is the people's will. So, you'll vote for us. And then it just kind of continues to become increasingly complex, starting from a simple kind of deception. So
yes, and the resolution is simple. The reason it's gotten more and more complex is, like you say, there's more and more light being shed on just how silly the arguments are.
Exactly.
And we're going to reach a point in which the resolution is very simple. It's, there is actually no legitimate form of government.
Exactly.
Men should not rule men, right? Oh, well, that's very simple.
In all of the illusions of increasingly sophisticated justifications, if you strip it down to what it really is, you have the same thing. So I do want to talk more about efficiency, but I think that's a whole separate conversation. So can we just conclude today with perhaps what you feel is the most essential takeaway from the discussion of technique?
Yes. In the midst of trying to learn something, master something, you have to have a conscious, deliberate focus on technique, on the how. You can't be worried about the execution. You can't be worried about anything other than trying to accurately identify objectively superior methods from getting from A to B, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, whether it's, it's something like you're learning how to weld or you're trying to learn economics. You have to go out of your way. And what that means is you have to take kind of a survey of all of the mutually exclusive claims that are out there, the different schools of thought, the different techniques in the martial arts. What does objectively superior technique look like in terms of efficiency and in terms of the basics? But it has to be deliberate. Don't be tricked into thinking that just doing is going to result in understanding or competence, because more likely than not, if you're just doing without that ultimate theoretical understanding of what you're doing and how you're doing it, you're probably going to end up farther away from the truth than where you started.